He growled at anyone who dared look him in the eye. His kennel door was clawed and bent from rage. The staff called him unreachable. But one afternoon, a little girl with a green scarf walked up, placed a hand-drawn picture at his gate, and just sat. She didn't speak, she didn't flinch, and something inside the broken beast blinked for the first time before we begin this unforgettable story. Would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The first snow had fallen over Pine Brook, Oregon, dusting the small town in silence. The pines stood tall like sentinels, their branches heavy with frost. The sky remained an iron-gray ceiling that pressed down on the land with a hush that made every breath seem too loud. At the edge of town, past the winding road that curved behind Whitmore Hill, the Haven Ridge Animal Rescue sat quietly, just a cluster of old concrete buildings with tin roofs and faded blue fencing. But today, inside Kennel the Hiker 12, something growled louder than the wind. Axel, a 6-year-old male German shepherd, was brought in 3 days earlier, chained and muzzled, his body covered in half-healed wounds. He had the look of a creature carved from fire and forged by grief, deep amber eyes set into a battle-worn face, fur matted with blood, soot, and patches of pink skin where hair had been singed. His left ear bore a jagged tear, and his front right paw still bled lightly at the base of the cracked claw. The attending vet suspected it was from where he'd yanked free of something, perhaps fencing, perhaps someone. The file attached to his crate was sparse. Aggressive, former guard training. Handler attacked. Approach with caution. None of the staff dared enter. He hadn't eaten since arriving, only stared, unblinking. From the darkest corner of the kennel, when anyone passed by, he growled low, not in fury, but as a warning, "I'm not ready." Among the staff was Shelby Carter, a woman in her early 40s with a tightly coiled bun of graying chestnut hair, standing just shy of 6 feet tall. Her frame was lean, almost wiry, shaped by years in the Army K-9 division. Her posture remained military straight, even in civilian clothes. Gray cargo pants and a black fleece jacket zipped up to her chin. A faint scar cut diagonally across her collarbone, a relic from her last deployment. A roadside bomb and the final day she saw her partner dog, Milo. Shelby hadn't worked with dogs since. She preferred paperwork, supply inventory, or medical prep. But fate had a cruel sense of humor, and Axel had arrived on her shift. Since then, she hadn't once walked within 3 feet of Kennel Sacker 12, not because she feared Axel, but because something in his eyes reminded her too much of Milo on his last day. Defiant, confused, betrayed by the world. That morning, while Shelby pretended to restock the kibble shelf for the 3rd time, she heard the rusted gate creak open behind her. "Emily's here," came the warm voice of Clarence Monroe, a retired violin repairman in his 70s, wearing his usual brown wool coat and a cap stitched with the faded words Portland Symphony Crew. He moved slowly now, one leg dragging slightly from a stroke 2 years ago, but he still carried the gentleness of a man who once listened to instruments breathe before bringing them back to life. Emily Grace, his granddaughter, followed close behind, bundled in an oversized yellow coat, her curly blonde hair escaping her knitted pink beanie. She was 8 years old, small for her age, and didn't speak, not since the car accident 2 years ago that claimed both her parents. The trauma had silenced her. The doctors said, mutism brought on by grief. She had learned to navigate the world through gestures, drawings, and glances. But Clarence had discovered something else, something unusual, Emily responded emotionally to the vibrations of sound through animals. A horse's hooves on packed earth, a cat's purr, a dog's bark not heard, but felt. A therapy not found in textbooks but stumbled upon in barnyards and rescue shelters. Clarence had arranged with Havenridge for weekly visits, hoping the resonance of animal energy would coax her into reconnecting. Shelby had her doubts, but she kept them quiet. Emily made no eye contact with anyone. She simply walked toward the kennels, her boots crunching faintly against the icy gravel, and stopped at Axel's. Shelby held her breath. The German shepherd stood, not lunging, not growling, just stood, stiff, alert, staring at the small figure before him. His breath fogged against the glass of the enclosure. The tension in his shoulders didn't shift, but his ears perked toward her. Emily tilted her head, then reached into her coat pocket and took out a crumpled drawing. It was hastily colored, just a sketch of a large dog sitting under a tree, a small girl at its side, their hands and paws touching. Emily knelt and slid the paper under the kennel door, her mitten brushing the cold metal. Axel didn't move. Shelby stepped forward. "Emily, sweetheart, maybe not this one." "Okay." Her voice was calm but tinged with the protective tone of someone bracing for a storm. But the storm never came. Axel's gaze dropped to the drawing, then lifted again to Emily. He made no sound. Emily didn't blink. They stared at each other through the iron in silence, and something older than language passed between them. Clarence stood further back, watching with a hand over his heart, his eyes misting. "She's never picked a dog before," he said quietly to Shelby. "She didn't pick him," Shelby replied, still staring. He saw her when they left. The drawing remained in Axel's kennel that night. Shelby did her final walkthrough. The other dogs were asleep or pacing, some barking, but in kennel number 12 Axel lay curled, not in the shadowy corner, but beside the paper Emily had left. His breathing was steady, his eyes closed. Shelby knelt. Just once. Outside the gate, she didn't speak, she didn't reach out, but she whispered under her breath, "Milo, is that you?" Axel didn't stir, but his tail thudded once, faint against the concrete. 3 days passed beneath the soft hush of Pine Brook's snow-covered skies. Winter thickened, blanketing rooftops and telephone wires in silence. The trees groaned gently under the weight of white, and the wind, though biting, moved with a strange kind of gentleness, like it didn't wish to disturb the peace that had grown, however fragile, inside Havenridge Animal Rescue. But the stillness wasn't just in the snow. It settled in kennel number 12 each afternoon. Emily Grace returned to that spot, always the same. Yellow coat zipped to the top, her pink knit beanie sagging slightly to the left, curly strands of blonde hair peeking out like shy whispers. She never approached too close. She simply sat cross-legged a few feet from Axel's enclosure, pulling her sketchpad from her backpack and resting it on her lap. No words, no sounds, only eyes that observed with quiet certainty. Shelby Carter watched from the office window, pretending to organize adoption files she had already alphabetized twice. Her breath clouded the glass as she leaned forward slightly, just enough to see the girl outside again, drawing. Emily didn't seem to care if anyone watched. She was absorbed in the ritual on the first afternoon. Emily brought a napkin-wrapped bundle inside, 4 small peanut butter dog biscuits, shaped like bones. She placed them just beside the kennel door, slid her notebook open, and began sketching. Axel remained in his corner. He didn't move. The second afternoon, the biscuits were back, fresh ones. Homemade by the look of them, a little uneven, perhaps made by a child's hand. Axel looked at them once, his ears flicked. He didn't growl, but he didn't eat either. It was on the third evening, when the sun had already dipped behind the pine trees and the shadows had stretched long, that Shelby, doing her final round, noticed something different. The biscuits were gone, not a crumb in sight. And Axel. He sat, not slumped, not hostile, but upright, his back straight, his eyes resting on a folded piece of paper tucked beside the bars. Emily's drawing. It showed a dog curled in a field of snow, stars above its head, and a girl lying beside it with their foreheads touching. Childish lines. Yes, but somehow intimate, deliberate. Shelby crouched low outside the kennel, the cold concrete biting through her jeans. Axel didn't growl, he didn't wag, he simply looked at her, measured, cautious. That night, Shelby dreamed of Milo again. Milo had been a sandy-furred Belgian Malinois, loyal to the bone, his bark sharper than bullets. But his eyes, oh, they had been soft, too soft for war. They had served 3 tours together. On the 4th, a roadside explosion had flung Shelby through a wall of rock and dust. Milo had not made it. His body had shielded hers. She woke in a hospital with a cracked rib cage, a fractured hip, and silence so loud it roared. She left the service 3 weeks later. Since then, no dog had gotten closer than a passing pat. Axel, in many ways, felt like Milo's mirror, but darker, heavier with something unspoken. The next morning, a new volunteer showed up at Haven Ridge, Isaiah Dean, 22, tall and broad-shouldered with a messy mop of ginger hair and a shy, open smile. He wore a faded army green parka, too big for his lanky frame, and walked with the awkward energy of someone eager to please but unsure where to start. A college sophomore on winter break. Isaiah had signed up for community service hours, hoping it might help his application for vet school. Shelby introduced him to the other staff, then assigned him to cleaning kennels. He moved quietly, humming under his breath, tunes that shifted from jazz to old rock without pattern. When he passed by kennel number 12, he paused. "Who's this guy?" he asked, crouching to meet Axel's eyes through the bars. Shelby appeared behind him. "That's Axel. Don't get too close. He's recovering." Isaiah didn't flinch. He just nodded, then glanced at the paper taped beside the door. Emily's artwork. Shelby raised an eyebrow. "You know her?" "Yeah, she's in my aunt's reading therapy group at the library. Doesn't talk, but draws like a little Van Gogh." Shelby didn't respond, but her eyes lingered longer on Axel than before. That afternoon, Emily came again, this time. She brought a harmonica. It was old, probably a hand-me-down. The brass was tarnished, the wooden edges worn smooth. She didn't play it, just placed it on the ground beside the biscuits and sat down, sketch pad in her lap. Her fingers worked slowly, pressing color into the page with short, deliberate strokes. Axel approached the gate. 2 steps, then another. He sniffed. The low growl rumbled faintly in his throat but didn't rise. His eyes flicked from the harmonica to the girl, then back to the harmonica. He didn't eat, he didn't take the toy, but he didn't retreat either. Emily looked up, and for the briefest moment, her lips parted, not to speak, but to smile, just slightly. Her eyes shimmered. Inside the office. Shelby watched through the surveillance monitor. The cold coffee in her hand had long gone lukewarm. She exhaled deeply and whispered under her breath, "It's happening." Isaiah wandered in, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You see it too?" Shelby nodded once, later that evening, as Shelby made her rounds. She lingered outside Axel's kennel, in her hand, a dog tag, Milo's. She hadn't looked at it in years. The chain was still stained with a line of sand. She stepped forward, knelt beside the gate, and gently placed the tag down near the spot where Emily always left her sketches. Axel lifted his head. Shelby didn't speak. She didn't need to. From the dark, Axel let out a breath, not a growl, not a whimper, just breath. And that was enough. The following Monday morning in Pine Brook was unusually bright. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a crystalline crust that crackled underfoot. The sky was washed in pale blue, and sunlight dripped through the pine trees like warm honey. Yet inside the Haven Ridge Animal Rescue, the atmosphere was quieter than the frost outside. Something had shifted, imperceptibly, but undeniably. Axel no longer retreated to the shadows of Kennels 12. Instead, each morning, when the front door creaked open and the jingling of keys signaled the arrival of staff, he stood, not rigidly, not in alarm, but expectantly, and by 3 o'clock each afternoon, when the wind picked up and the sky dulled to gray, he would pace once, then settle himself by the gate, his ears alert not for danger, but for the soft crunch of small boots in snow. Emily Grace had become his compass. She arrived that day in a new scarf, a deep forest green that matched the glimmer in her eyes. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold, and she carried a small metal tin wrapped in a hand towel. As always, she didn't speak. She simply walked to Axel's kennel, crouched, and placed the tin beside the harmonica she had left before. She opened the lid slowly, revealing small cubes of beef jerky. Axel sniffed, head tilted. He didn't bark, he didn't lunge, he stepped forward, cautious but not trembling, and took one piece delicately from her fingers. From the hallway, Diana Morrow, the shelter's part-time vet tech, paused with her clipboard in hand. Diana was in her late 50s, a sharp-eyed woman with tightly coiled gray curls and reading glasses that always dangled from her collar by a sparkly purple chain. She was the type who didn't waste words, but had an instinct for animals that made her indispensable. She leaned against the wall and whispered to Shelby, who stood a few feet away, "That dog's not broken, just waiting for the right language." Shelby nodded silently. The comment lingered with her longer than she cared to admit. Later that afternoon, something new happened. Emily reached into her backpack and pulled out a larger sheet of drawing paper. It was folded carefully, corners pressed flat. Her fingers, gloveless now, were red from the cold, but she moved with care as she opened the sheet and placed it between the bars of Axel's kennel. Then, as she always did, she sat down and waited. Axel sniffed the air, then approached slowly. He lowered his head to the paper, his nose brushing lightly over the page. The drawing was different this time, larger, more detailed. It showed a child, Emily's unmistakable round face and curly hair, and a large German shepherd beside her. His eyes focused, his brow softened. Her hand was resting on his forehead. Shelby approached, walking slowly for the first time in weeks. She entered the kennel aisle without carrying her clipboard like a shield. As she reached Axel's door, her hand unconsciously moved to rest against the latch. Axel turned his head, their eyes met. He didn't growl. Shelby hesitated, then knelt. Her hand reached out, palm facing downward, and touched his shoulder gently. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a bark, not a growl. More like a warning hum, not hostile, but uncertain. Shelby pulled her hand back. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're not ready, and maybe neither am I," from the side. Diana Morrow watched the exchange. "That," she said, "is trust beginning to breathe." That evening, The shelter received a visit from a potential adopter, not for Axel, but for another pup named Benny. The visitor, Helen Graves, was a retired librarian from Seattle, short and cheerful, always wrapped in earth-tone shawls. Helen had a kind laugh and the kind of face that made people talk to her in grocery stores. She had been looking for a quiet dog to keep her company in her woodland cottage outside town. As she passed by Kennel Sessa 12, she paused. "That's the one I read about in the town paper, isn't it?" she asked Isaiah, who was mopping nearby, the one who changed for the girl. Isaiah smiled. "That's Axel, and the girl's name is Emily." Helen nodded thoughtfully. "I hope she keeps him." Isaiah didn't answer. He just glanced toward the drawing still pinned to Axel's gate. When Emily left that day, she did something different. As she stood, brushing snow off her knees, she reached forward, not to touch, but to hover her hand just over Axel's head, as if remembering the drawing she had made. Axel didn't flinch. He lifted his chin slightly, accepting the invisible touch, and when she turned to go, he didn't return to the dark corner. He sat beside the gate, watching her until the door shut behind her. The sky had darkened far too quickly that day in Pine Brook. Morning had started crisp and golden, sunshine warming the dew off the grass. But by noon, storm clouds rolled in from the west like a tide of bruised wool. The wind changed, colder now, whispering warnings through the trees. By mid-afternoon, a school bus wound its way up the road toward the Hayward Preserve, an old forested park on the outskirts of town used for school outings and science walks. Among the third-grade class from Pine Brook Elementary was Emily Grace, bundled in her green scarf, her small gloved hands tucked into her jacket, eyes wide with quiet curiosity. Emily was accompanied by Ms. Rachel Henley. Her homeroom teacher, Rachel, in her early 30s, was tall and freckled, her copper-red hair always worn in a loose braid. Her voice was soft and nurturing, often drawing the attention of the shyest kids. She had a particular fondness for Emily, not out of pity, but out of admiration for the girl's quiet resilience. Rachel always made sure Emily was near her when the class traveled anywhere, but nature has its own plans. As the class wandered along the leaf-strewn trail, a sudden movement darted across the path. A squirrel, bushy-tailed and bold, while most children squealed and pointed. Emily broke into a silent chase, her feet light and quick. She moved faster than Rachel expected, and in the briefest blink, the girl had slipped off the marked path and vanished between the trees. By the time Rachel realized, Emily was gone. The forest grew darker with every minute. Rain began as a whisper but quickly turned to cold slaps of water. Thunder rolled in the distance. Panic set in, back at Haven Ridge. Shelby Carter was finishing the afternoon reports when the phone rang. It was Ms. Henley's voice, shaky and breathless. "Emily, she's missing. She ran into the woods during the field trip. That was almost an hour ago." Shelby didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She just grabbed her coat, keys, and ran for the kennel wing. Inside Kennel Sessa 12, Axel was already pacing. Shelby paused at the door, staring into his amber eyes, something fierce rising in her chest. The storm outside howled, and then, as if hearing the wind's cry, Axel threw himself at the gate, not in rage, but with focused urgency. The latch buckled, twisted, and before Shelby could even reach the lever, Axel broke free. She didn't stop him, grabbing a leash from the hook. Shelby called out to Isaiah, who was mopping the corridor. "Stay here. Call search and rescue. I'm going with them." Axel moved like a shadow down the hallway and out the door, nose to the wind, muscles taut, driven not by instinct but by something older. Bond. Shelby sprinted after him, barely keeping pace as he veered through side streets, vaulted a ditch, and charged toward the tree line where Hayward Preserve lay in silence beneath the storm. Within 20 minutes, Shelby and Axel were in the woods. The trees groaned, swaying under wind and rain. The path was barely visible now. Mud splashed with every step. Shelby shouted Emily's name into the wind, though she knew the girl might not answer. Beside her. Axel paused. He sniffed the air, turned sharply, then bolted left into thick underbrush. Shelby followed. A few yards in, Axel stopped, his body stiffened. At his paws lay a strip of green cloth, Emily's scarf, soaked and caught on a jagged root. He sniffed it, let out a low growl, not in anger, but in fear, and pressed forward. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the forest in ghostly white. Then they saw her, curled beneath the hollow of a fallen tree, knees tucked to chest, was Emily. Her lips were pale, her hands trembling, her glasses were missing, her hair wet and stuck to her forehead. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were wide with terror. The thunder boomed again, and she flinched. Axel stepped forward first. He approached slowly, lowering his body into a crouch. When he reached her, he didn't bark. He simply laid his large frame beside her, wrapping himself around her small form. He let out a deep, resonant growl, not threatening, but steady, like a heartbeat, a sound to shield her from fear. Emily clung to his fur, burying her face in his neck. Shelby reached them seconds later. She dropped to her knees beside them, heart hammering. The rain pelted her back, but she didn't care. "Come on, baby girl, we've got you." She wrapped Emily in her jacket, helped her onto her lap, and let Axel rest his head across the girl's legs. Tears mixed with rain as Shelby whispered, "You did it. Axel, you did it again." By the time the rescue team arrived, guided by Isaiah's call and Rachel Henley's desperate coordination, Shelby and Axel had already shielded Emily from the worst of the storm. She was shivering, but conscious. The paramedics checked her vitals, and though her lips still hadn't spoken, her hands never once let go of Axel's thick, rain-soaked fur. The air in Pinebrook shifted in the weeks after the storm. The snow began to melt. The riverbanks swelled with icy runoff, and crocuses poked their purple crowns through the thawing soil. The town, sleepy and scarred by winter, felt reborn. So did the hearts within Haven Ridge Animal Rescue. But nowhere was this transformation more apparent than in the girl who once didn't speak, and the dog who once didn't trust. Emily Grace now arrived at the center not as a guest, but as part of the family. Axel walked freely through the front halls of Haven Ridge, wearing a newly issued blue harness embroidered with the words "Therapy Dog in Training." His gait was calm, tail level, eyes focused. He no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps or sudden voices. He watched, he listened, and he chose when to engage with a brush of his nose, a press of his head against a nervous hand, or by lying beside children who struggled to stay still. And always, always, Emily was nearby. She now lived with her grandfather, Clarence Monroe, full-time. Their small, sunlit cottage at the edge of the woods had been modified with the help of the shelter community. A new fence for Axel, a heated dog cot, and even a small art corner for Emily, with brushes and paint sets donated by townsfolk who had read about her in the local paper. The town had rallied around them like threads weaving back into a frayed tapestry. One crisp morning, the center held a quiet celebration to formally introduce Axel as a certified therapy companion. The walls of the main activity room were decorated with cut-out paper dogs made by children, and a new brass tag glinted on Axel's collar, his name. beneath a tiny engraved heart. Emily stood in front of a small group of shelter staff, volunteers, and a few townspeople. She wore her green scarf, the one she had nearly lost in the woods. Her hand clutched a folded piece of paper. Her grandfather stood behind her, gentle hand on her shoulder, his soft eyes misted. Shelby Carter stood to the side, arms folded loosely, trying to seem detached, though every fiber in her body trembled with emotion. She wore her usual black fleece, but beneath it was a dark green shirt with an embroidered insignia, K9 Search and Rescue Corps. She had made her decision. The experience with Axel and Emily had stirred something in her that had lain dormant for years. She had contacted an old friend in the military and found an opening in a specialized training unit, not for combat this time, but for rescue, for teaching dogs like Axel to do what Milo once had: find the lost, comfort the broken, and carry hope on 4 legs. Now, as the room quieted, something unimaginable happened. Emily stepped forward, Axel at her side, and in a small, clear voice said one word, her first in 2 years. Axel. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The silence that followed held more power than thunder. Shelby turned slowly, her eyes wide. Clarence's breath caught Isaiah Dean, who was standing near the back with a mop in hand, nearly dropped the bucket. Even Diana Morrow, composed as always, lowered her clipboard and pressed a hand to her heart. Emily knelt beside Axel, who licked her cheek once, then laid down, curling into her side, later that day. Shelby sat at the old upright piano in the therapy room. It had been donated years ago. Its keys chipped and uneven, but its sound still rich and full. She played a simple tune, an old soldier's lullaby her grandfather had once sung to her. Emily lay beside Axel on the rug, her hands absent-mindedly sketching swirls of light and sky. Axel's breathing rose and fell in sync with hers. Shelby paused. Her fingers hovered over the final note. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said softly. Emily didn't respond. She just kept drawing. Clarence entered with a cup of tea and placed it on the piano. He was slower these days, his knees cracking with every step, but his eyes had grown brighter since Axel came home. "I hear she's planning something for you," he murmured, sipping. "She's been working on it every night." Shelby raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He only smiled. The next morning, beneath the wide spring sky, the staff and a few close friends gathered by the front gates of Haven Ridge. Shelby wore a new uniform, functional, proud, and worn like a second skin. Axel sat beside Emily, tail thumping gently. Emily reached into her coat and pulled out a rolled piece of paper. She walked toward Shelby and placed it in her hand. Then she stood back, eyes locked with Shelby's, her expression quiet but unwavering. Shelby unrolled the paper. It was a drawing, done in soft pastels and charcoal, richer than any of Emily's earlier sketches. 3 figures stood beneath a giant sun. One was Axel, bold and strong, head raised to the light. One was Emily, hand resting on his back. And the third was a woman, tall, hair in a loose bun, one hand raised as if to wave goodbye. All 3 were surrounded by light. There were no shadows, no darkness in their eyes. Shelby's throat tightened. She folded the drawing carefully, tucked it into the pocket above her heart, then knelt beside Axel. She pressed her forehead to his. "Thank you for finding her," she whispered. Then she stood, nodded once to Clarence, and stepped through the gate. Emily and Axel watched her disappear down the road until even the dust had settled. Sometimes, the loudest prayers are the ones never spoken. A broken dog who had lost all trust, and a silent girl who had lost all words, found healing not through force, but through presence, through love that waited, watched, and never gave up. Axel and Emily remind us that miracles don't always come with lightning and thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the form of a child's drawing, or a dog laying down beside you in the dark. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was the gentle hand of God, guiding two souls toward each other, each carrying half a heart, waiting to be made whole, in a world that rushes. Their story reminds us to slow down, to listen without words, and to believe in second chances. And maybe someone watching this right now is waiting for their own Axel. Or maybe you are the Axel to someone else, if this story touched your heart. Please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Don't forget to comment Amen if you believe that God still works through the quietest moments. Hit subscribe to hear more stories that restore your faith in the goodness of life, and may God bless you and those you love, especially the ones who feel forgotten.